Hey guys, and welcome back. If you're new here, hi, my name's Georgia, and on my platforms I mostly cover unsolved true crime, but today I'm bringing you a solved case. However, that's not to say there aren't many big unanswered questions surrounding this story and the brutal murders of an entire family. The biggest question being, why did this happen? What was the motive? Despite almost a century of investigation and speculation, no one really knows why Charles Lawson decided to murder almost his entire family. But first, I want to thank Audible for sponsoring this episode. Today we're talking about the complications of family, what happens when family goes wrong, which also just happens to be the focus of the podcast, The Second Victim, a story about family secrets and one young black British woman's fight to protect and prosecute her parents. Daisy is the second victim of a crime her father committed against her mother, and over the course of the series, this raw and unflinching story unfolds. It is truly gripping and will keep you on the edge of your seat. Audible's a modern entertainment powerhouse. There is literally never a day that I don't have something on the go on my Audible app, whether that's an audiobook or a podcast. They constantly have fresh and exciting content being added to the platform, and The Second Victim is exclusive to Audible, so you're not going to find it anywhere else. If you want to go and check out The Second Victim, you can click on the link in the top line of the description box down below to listen, and I highly recommend that you do. But for our story today, let's start at the very beginning. In 1911, when Charles Davis Lawson, who was known as Charlie to everyone, married Fanny Manring. Over the next few years, the couple have 8 children: Arthur, Marie, William, Carrie, Mabel, James, Raymond and Mary Lou, all of whom survived past infancy apart from William, who was born in 1918 and died in 1920. In 1918, the family moved from Lawsonville, North Carolina to quaint town Germantown, following in the footsteps of Charlie's brothers. And I say town, Germantown is actually an unincorporated community, which as of the 2020 census only has a population of 790 people. So I'm imagining it was even smaller back in the 1920s. The family worked as tenant tobacco farmers as part of a sharecropping scheme, and by 1927 they'd actually saved up enough money to purchase their own farm on Brook Cove Road. On the land there was this derelict farmhouse which was to house all 9 of them. It was a very sort of simple rural life, and it was the norm for most people living in this area. They were by no means a rich family. Some months they very much struggled to make ends meet with so many children, but the Lawsons were very influential people in town. They were well respected and their neighbours all really liked them. This was an area in which nobody really had much money, which is why it was super exciting for the whole family when around a week before Christmas in 1929, Charlie decided to take the entire family into the local town of Winston-Salem, where he buys them brand new clothes, something which was absolutely a massive luxury. In this time, new clothes were something that would only come around every so often to replace old worn clothes, and even then these old clothes had to be completely beyond the point of repair. Unless you were super wealthy, you didn't just go and buy new clothes on a weekly basis, like fast fashion wasn't a thing. So Charlie sets his family loose, letting Fanny and the kids pick out literally anything they wanted, and then he bought it all: clothes, jewellery, shoes. Once the shopping was complete, Charlie then took them all to have a family portrait taken, which again was a big luxury in this time. Now for my YouTube viewers, the portrait is on screen right now, but for my podcast listeners and my visually impaired listeners, this is a black and white portrait. The older family members standing in the back and the younger sat on a bench in front. In the back from left to right we have Arthur, Marie, Charles and Fanny, who's holding 4-month-old Mary Lou. And then sat on the bench in front, from left to right, we have James, Mabel, Raymond, and then Carrie. Now there has been a lot of analysis of this portrait over the last century. People pointing out who's looking in what direction, who looks comfortable next to each other. This tiny thing must mean this. I've seen analysis saying that Marie looks very uncomfortable stood next to her father, that they all look miserable, that Fanny looks angry. But I really don't think we can make such analysis from a single photo. I don't think we can know the family dynamics just from this. Taking photos in this time in 1929 was a much different process than what it is nowadays. With phones in our pocket, we can take multiple photos a second. If we don't like one, it's okay because there are 50 others, we can just take more. But back in the 1920s, photography tech was definitely improving, but it's likely this was just a one-shot, one-chance kind of situation. The whole family had to stand there with a still expression to get the shot they wanted. Maybe they'd have a couple of goes if they were lucky. My research wasn't entirely clear, but photography in this time was expensive. It had to work quickly. Anybody who has maybe better knowledge of photography in the 1920s, please do feel free to info dump everything you know in the comments down below. I really did try and do my research. It was very unclear, using a lot of terminology that I didn't really understand, so I'm not the best person to share. But what I can tell you is photography was more expensive and you had less chances. I mean, that's kind of part of the reason why modern times have this perception of Victorians being such serious people, because they tend to have such stern faces in their photos. But it's often because they had to remain completely still as the photo was taken. Now, I know 1929 is obviously way past Victorian times, but that's just a little fun fact for you. You had like one shot, it had to be right. Getting a family portrait such as this was really unusual behaviour for a working class family like the Lawsons, particularly one living so rurally. The fact that Charlie was so happy to spend this money, the fact he seemingly wanted to document his family, has been used as evidence that even at this point in time, a week before their deaths, he was already planning what he was going to do. I mean, it didn't matter if they spent all their money, they weren't going to be here in a week. I do find myself wondering what the family thought about this, about the photo, about the portrait, especially the older children and Fanny. Did they think this was odd behaviour at the time, or were they just excited at the prospect? There's no way of knowing, of course. And then we come to Christmas Day 1929, the 25th of December. That morning, the family wake up excited and begin to prepare for their feast that afternoon. Marie wakes up early, especially to bake her signature dessert, a cake. She ices it and decorates it with raisins and then leaves it to cool, and it was later found completely untouched. As many families often did on Christmas morning, Charlie and 16-year-old Arthur decide to take their beagles out for a hunt with their guns, and soon they run out of ammunition. At that point, Charlie sends Arthur into town to go and buy some more, and then he heads straight down to the tobacco barn. At this same time, 12-year-old Carrie and 7-year-old Maybelle decide to set off to visit their aunt and uncle who lived very nearby. They just wanted to wish them a Merry Christmas, but they would never make it. A warning here that from this point onwards, things are going to get violent and pretty hard to listen to. What happened next was just heartbreaking. As the girls set off on their walk, they headed past the tobacco barn where their father was lying in wait. As soon as they came into view, he shot them both with a 12-gauge shotgun, and then once they were down, he bludgeoned them with the same gun to ensure they were dead. He then dragged the bodies of his daughters into the barn, which is where they would later be found. Charlie then heads back home to the family home where Fanny is waiting on the porch. Upon approaching her, he shoots her dead as well with the same 12-gauge shotgun. As you can imagine, this is very loud and it startles Marie, who's inside the house baking. She screams and 2-year-old Raymond and 4-year-old James run to find a hiding place, not having a clue what's going on. As Charlie entered the house, he was greeted with a hysterical Marie and he immediately shoots her. He then goes through the house searching for his young sons and shoots them as well. Lastly, he finds the baby, Mary Lou, and for whatever reason decides against shooting her. Instead, he goes for a much more brutal murder, with her death certificate stating that she was bludgeoned to death. Once the murders were complete, Charlie seemingly went to the effort of posing his family's bodies. When they were later discovered, each person had their arms crossed over their chests, and they were found resting their heads on either pillows or rocks, depending on which source you want to believe. I'm inclined to think the girls in the barn had rocks under their heads and the family members in the home had pillows. As is ever kind of the issue with historical cases such as this one, a game of telephone over the years very much distorts details. Coverage at the time of this wasn't great, and therefore a lot of it does become speculation. Although of course I do always do my best to get the story as straight as I possibly can. The way the bodies were found here was kind of in direct contrast with the brutality of the murders. Charlie had gone to the effort of posing their bodies, ensuring they were comfortable in death. This was an act of tenderness, of love, but it couldn't be considering what he'd just done. It's one of those situations where you can try as hard as you want to get into the mindset of the killer, to understand the motivations, but the reality is that we're just never going to be able to understand. Now, of course, the sound of the gunshots on that Christmas morning alerted a number of neighbours as to something very strange going on at the Lawsons, so a number of them go to see what's happening, finding the gruesome scene in the home. The police were soon notified and everyone noted that Charlie Lawson was nowhere to be seen. Of course, as well as Charlie's body, Arthur's body also wasn't anywhere to be seen because he'd been spared by his father for whatever reason. He'd been sent into town to buy bullets. But I do suspect that Arthur kind of turned up at his family home around the same time as the neighbours. Some sources say that Arthur was actually the one to discover his family's bodies, but I really hope for his sake that wasn't the case. It was claimed that the crime scene was so bloody that neighbours were able to scoop up the blood with a coal shovel, with the Statesville Record Landmark for December 30th, 1929 reporting. Immersed in the clotted blood on the living room floor where the 5 bodies were found was a little Christmas poem. Most of its words had been blotted out by the red stain oozing over it, but the large number of curiosity seekers who passed through the death chamber today could plainly make out the words Santa Claus. Which I do think really sort of sets the scene for this tragedy. This was Christmas morning. There were so many children in this house who would have been excited to get their presents from Santa Claus, to celebrate with their family, to eat their meal, and then they're killed by their father. The consensus has always been that this massacre was one that was pre-planned by Charlie Lawson. The reckless spending of the money the week beforehand, the family portrait to freeze them in time as a memory of them. But the big question has always been, why was Arthur spared? Did Charlie always plan to spare his oldest son, or was it just when the opportunity arose and they ran out of bullets, he made a split-second decision, an excuse to save his oldest son from what he knew was about to be? Arthur was the oldest son. Throughout history, it's been very important for the patriarchy for the oldest son to continue on the family name. So maybe that was the motivation in Charlie sparing him. Maybe they were just closer. Maybe they'd had a really nice morning together hunting rabbits and Charlie just couldn't bring himself to do it. Some might argue, however, that maybe it's crueler to leave Arthur as the only one alive, the only one to deal with the trauma and the aftermath, than it is to kill him. A few hours later, as the authorities and the neighbours were at the Lawson farm, they heard another gunshot in the distance, which eventually led Arthur, a police officer, and the family beagles to Charlie's body in the woods, where seemingly he'd also chosen to end his own life. Surrounding the spot where he was found, next to a dogwood tree, were deep footprints in a circle, suggesting that he'd just been pacing around in circles for the previous few hours, maybe trying to work up the courage to end his own life, or maybe processing what he'd just done. With his body, authorities also recovered apparently 2 very cryptic letters addressed to his parents, one which simply read, "Blame nobody but I," and the other, "Trouble can cause." Once again, different sources will provide different wording of these notes, but the gist remains the same. The very next day, the Twin-City Sentinel published a story about this case, writing, "Believed to have become suddenly insane, Charles Lawson, 42, who lived near Germantown in Stokes County, Christmas Day, killed his wife Fanny, 38, and 6 of his 7 children, and then committed suicide." 2 days after the event, the Lawsons were buried in a grave together at Germantown's Browder Cemetery. In what was kind of a controversial move, Charlie was actually buried alongside his family in the very same plot. The funeral was said to be attended by a number of grief-stricken friends and family, including Arthur, the lone Lawson family survivor. But as well as them, it's said that thousands of outsiders and well-wishers also attended, some sources saying as many as 5,000 people. Or actually, no, I say well-wishers, perhaps that's not the best term to use for these people. These onlookers literally climbed the trees around the graveyard just to get a peek at the coffins. They were drawn to the scene by nothing more than a prurient curiosity about this case. A narrative we're hearing a lot today as people really begin to pay mind to the morals and ethics around true crime and its coverage online and in the media is that this sort of current fascination with true crime is a new thing. But honestly, researching history and true crime and the intersection of those as I do, I would say that today's treatment of true crime is probably the most moral it's ever been. People are much more mindful today compared to in history. Now, that's not me saying it's perfect today now by any means. I am well aware of the problems, believe me, but people used to be so shameless. Of course, some people came to the funeral out of pure respect for the family, but so many came just for the story, to be a part of these tragic murders. According to the Salem Winston Journal, for 3 miles along the road, cars were parked while men and women, many with babies in their arms, made their way through the mud to the cemetery. They were crammed and jammed to get a glimpse of the 7 caskets and tuned their ears to hear the tributes paid. A very sort of interesting point of discussion over the years has been the fact that the Lawson family headstone features the symbol of the square and compass, the single most identifiable symbol of Freemasonry, representing virtue and wisdom. Now, Freemasonry isn't a religion, but it is a secular movement. New members are expected to acknowledge a belief in a godlike superior being, but it's not a religion. It's basically a secret society. It's the oldest fraternal organisation in the world, in which, according to their website, Freemasonry uses building analogies to teach members how to lead productive lives that benefit the community that they live in. Basically, it's like a really serious form of networking between men, and they also donate a lot of money to charity. It's a social and philanthropic organisation. I don't really think the Freemasonry has necessarily much to do with the murder. I did see some speculation online about Charlie Lawson, his secret society, but I do sort of think it's a thing where people hear the word Freemasons and they run with it. It likely didn't have any connection to their deaths or what Charlie Lawson did. Alongside the purported Freemason symbol, the headstone also read, "Not now, but in the coming years, it will be a better land. We'll read the meaning of our tears and then sometime we'll understand." I wish I could tell you that the remaining Lawson, Arthur, went on to live a very full life, but sadly he died aged just 31 in 1945, leaving behind a wife and 4 children. I'm pretty sure his cause of death was a car accident, and honestly, this entire story is just tragic from beginning to end. The why behind the Lawson murders has always been the biggest question here. Like I said, this is a solved case, but it's not really solved because we don't know why it happened. It's something that nobody's ever been able to answer, but there are 2 pretty widely circulated theories that we're going to discuss today, with the first one being a possible head injury. On my platform over the years, we have covered endless cases in which head trauma has been speculated to lead to violent crimes. Numerous serial killers are thought to have suffered head injuries at some point in their life. I mean, just off of the top of my head, we have Richard Ramirez, Henry Lee Lucas, Ed Gein, all known to have suffered some degree of head injury. And Charlie Lawson was also known to have suffered a head injury. In the evenings, Charlie, Fanny, Arthur and Marie would often work together renovating the farmhouse, and one evening, whilst removing rotting timbers, Charlie is known to have hit himself in the forehead with an axe. After this event, family and neighbours all noticed a change in his personality. Now, it should be noted that Charlie's brain was analysed during autopsy at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and medical professionals found no particular abnormalities. However, a bit of research tells me that even today, with modern imaging scans, frontal lobe damage can only sometimes be diagnosed. In many cases, to make a proper diagnosis, a neuropsychological evaluation is necessary, and that has to be whilst a person is still alive. Of course, in autopsy back in 1929, they wouldn't have been able to scan this brain, but they would have been able to look at it in person. However, even a human eye isn't going to be able to see this kind of damage. Sometimes there are visible lesions in frontal lobe damage, but not always. If Charlie did have brain damage after this accident, it likely would have been frontal lobe damage or frontal lobe syndrome, with the frontal lobe being responsible for all kinds of human function, regulating emotions, social interactions, personality, impulse control. Frontal lobe syndrome is nowhere near as rare as you might think it would be, but it does affect everyone in very different ways. For some, you might never know. For others, it will affect their behaviour for the rest of their lives. I mean, just think the serial killers that I mentioned previously. It is possible that, like many serial killers, the head injury led to a proclivity towards violence for Charlie, a hatred for the people he previously loved, and a lack of impulse control. Of course, there's no way of knowing how true that is, but it is a pretty legitimate theory. And whilst it does seem unlikely, this entire event was unlikely. Birmingham City University researchers Elizabeth Yardley, David Wilson and Adam Lyons have spent a lot of time researching the phenomenon of familicide, and they've divided it into kind of 4 groups, 4 reasons why this might happen. There's anomic, disappointed, self-righteous and paranoid. Anomic is when the perpetrator sees his family as purely a status symbol, something he had to have in order to be taken seriously in society. And when his economic or whatever status collapses, he sees his family as surplus to requirements. They're not needed anymore, they're just extra cost, and so he kills them. Disappointed is often when the perpetrator seeks to punish his family for not living up to his expectations and ideals of family life. The self-righteous killer murders to exact revenge upon the mother, blaming the entire act on her. It's her fault that he's doing this. And finally, the paranoid killer kills their family as they attempt to protect them from something even worse than death. So, what could the Lawsons come under here? Well, we don't know, because the entire point of this episode is that we don't know Charlie's motivations. But it's been long suspected that if it wasn't the head injury, his motivation may have been anomic, with the murders coming just a number of days after the Wall Street crash, the entire country about to enter a period of the Great Depression. Perhaps he knew with their precarious finances they weren't going to survive. Or perhaps he was paranoid, trying to protect them from something worse, something brought about by his own actions. In a 1990 book called White Christmas, Bloody Christmas by Trudy J. Smith about this case, a claim is made that Charlie had been sexually abusing his daughter Marie for quite a while, and she had fallen pregnant as a result. Now, this claim comes from an anonymous source who allegedly heard a rumour during a tour of the Lawson home shortly after the murders. As often happened in this time after such a crime, the site of the home became a victim of dark tourism, with Charlie's brother Marion knowing that Arthur was going to need money to maintain the mortgage payments. He was just 16, like he needed money. Huge amounts of visitors were coming to nose around the land anyway, so they figured they might as well profit off of them. Within just 10 days of the massacre, Marion had the cabin securely fenced off and began running newspaper ads, advertising tours for 25 cents a person. He pulled in as many as 500 people in those early days, and it was on one of these tours that the rumours allegedly started. The day before the book was published, the author Smith received a call from Estella Lawson, a relative who she'd actually already interviewed once for the book. Stella claimed then to have overheard Fanny's sister-in-laws and aunts, including her own mother, Jetty Lawson, discussing how Fanny had confided in them about being concerned there was an incestuous relationship between Charlie and Marie. Now, Jetty Lawson actually died in early 1928, nearly 2 whole years before the murders, which suggests that Fanny might have been suspicious long before the murders happened. In 2006, Smith published another book called The Meeting of Our Tears, in which a close friend of Marie's called Ella May disclosed that a few weeks before Christmas 1929, Marie had confided in her that she was pregnant by her own father, and that both of her parents were aware of what was going on. Now, please bear in mind that we don't know if this is all true, but if it was and Fanny did know about it, then there are likely myriad reasons as to why she was powerless to stop whatever was going on. Women had no power in this time, particularly a working class woman like Fanny. Had she made a stand and left Charlie, her and her children would likely be in an even worse position. We don't know if he was abusive, we don't know if she was coerced, we don't know how or if Fanny tried to protect her daughter. This is all pure speculation. But obviously, if this is all true, then it would have been something that Charlie would not have wanted to come out. He knew that it was incredibly wrong, obviously. He knew he would essentially be outcast from society if this news got out. He was sexually abusing his own daughter and she got pregnant. It doesn't necessarily explain why he felt the need to massacre his entire family. If he was worried about it getting out, why not just Marie and Fanny? But then he'd be left to care for all the kids alone. Maybe he didn't trust himself with younger girls. Maybe this is all just complete rumour and nothing like this ever actually happened. I did have the question about surely if Marie was pregnant then it would have been noticed at autopsy, but I actually don't know if a full autopsy for every person took place in this case. I mean, why would they need to? The cause of death was pretty obvious. I know an autopsy for Charlie Lawson definitely took place because they did look at his brain, but for the rest of them, I really don't know. I also wonder if they were to exhume Marie's body now, could they find out nearly a century later if she was pregnant? Or maybe it's best just leave her to rest, leave her in peace. I mean, I know everyone's curious, I know that's just like an innate part of humanity, but is it really worth digging up an entire family, disturbing their peace, just to provide some answers for people now? I don't know. These crimes were so incredibly disturbing, and that didn't get better after the fact. In the research for her book, Trudy J. Smith visited someone whose ancestor had visited the cabin shortly after the killings, and this family still had a jar which contained Fanny's blood that they had scooped up from the edge of the porch as a souvenir. This family were never going to know peace. Charlie Lawson's guns, the bricks from the old chimney, even the raisins that Marie had used in her cake that morning, all became collector's items passed through generations of people in North Carolina and treated as treasured family heirlooms. Even the dogwood tree next to which Charlie was found was stripped bare, bark, branches, leaves, all gone. Everyone wanted a piece of this murder because in this quiet place in Germantown, nothing else really happened. In the tours put on by Marion Lawson, people literally stripped the house bare. Anything that could be removed quickly was gone, and anything that remained, namely the heavy furniture, all ended up being auctioned off at the end of January 1930, just a month after the murders. And of course, the murder weapons were some of the most popular items. According to the Statesville Record Landmark, the shotguns used to slay the 7 members of his family attracted the greatest interest and went under rapid-fire bidding. Other articles that held intimate connection with the Christmas Day tragedy also bought favourable pieces under the bidding of curiosity seekers. There was even a tent show with Lawson family memorabilia put together by Marion for the local Mount Airy's County show. They took the crib and pieces of furniture out of the home and just showed it at fairs for people to see. Following Arthur's death years later, stories of ghosts and curses and premonitions ran rampant in the Germantown area. The cabin was eventually demolished though, and any interest in the tragedy did start to wane. This is one of those enduring mysteries that caught people's attentions, and I have my own theory as to why. I suspect it caught people's attention early on because it was solved. There was never any question as to who had been the one to commit these crimes. It was Charles Lawson. People didn't have to worry and speculate and be scared of the bogeyman turning up at their house. But that element of mystery was still there in the motivation. Why did he do this? As I said before, this was an incredibly quiet rural area. This murder put Germantown on the map. Nothing much happened here, so of course people are going to be fascinated, and that is why we're still talking about it 100 years on. You only have to look at view numbers across YouTube to see that people much prefer listening and learning about solved cases. People want to have that conclusion. Unsolved cases, it doesn't have that satisfaction. And this case, like I said, it has everything. It has the solved element, but it also has the mystery. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Thank you for choosing to spend this time with me and with the Lawson family, everyone apart from Charlie, obviously. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure you give it a thumbs up. If you are listening on my podcast, and please maybe give my podcast a review. If you're watching this on YouTube, then thumbs up, leave a comment down below, subscribe to my channel. If you would like to look at becoming a channel member, that would be much appreciated, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.